You remember that sound, right? The Nokia tune? It was everywhere. I mean, Nokia wasn't just another phone company, they were the phone company, an absolute institution. And then, almost overnight, they just vanished from our pockets. So this is a story of how that titan fell and how kind of secretly a giant was reborn.
To really get how massive this collapse was, we have to start at the absolute peak. Let's go back to 2008. One out of every three mobile phones sold on the entire planet was a Nokia. That's a staggering 33% of the global market. I mean, their dominance was just absolute. We're talking revenues over $76 billion. The Nokia brand stood for quality, for innovation, and of course for phones so durable they basically became a legend. They weren't just leading the market. For all intents and purposes, they were the market.
So the big question is, how? How does a company at the absolute top of its game, the peak of its power, fall so far, so incredibly fast? What on earth happened to the undisputed king of phones?
All right, let's set the scene. Our story really kicks off in 2007. This was the year everything started to shift. At the time, Nokia felt totally invincible. But a new challenger was about to step onto the stage, and they were not playing by the same rules at all. So, when Steve Jobs got on stage and showed off the very first iPhone, the story goes that Nokia's engineers actually laughed. You see, their whole philosophy was built around hardware. For Nokia, a phone had to be tough. Failing a drop test was a deal breaker. But Apple, they came at it from a totally different angle. They cared about a sleek user experience, a touchscreen interface, and, this is the really key part, an entire ecosystem of apps. Nokia just saw a fragile, expensive toy. They completely missed the revolution staring them in the face. By the time they finally realized the threat, their big response was this thing, the N97, which they actually nicknamed the iPhone killer. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was a total disaster. The touchscreen was clumsy and it was still running on their ancient operating system Symbian. And the real battleground now was the apps. Symbian was an absolute nightmare for developers. It was old, it was clunky, you just couldn't build the slick apps people were starting to demand. So the N97 launched with about 500 apps. Apple already had over 100,000. You see, this wasn't a war of devices anymore, it was a war of ecosystems, and Nokia was completely outmatched. So, the failure of the N97 was a huge wake-up call. Nokia knew they needed a massive change, and in September 2010, they brought in an outsider to shake things up, a top Microsoft executive named Stephen Elop, and he had a reputation as a real agent of change. And Elop moved fast, like incredibly fast. By early 2011, he sent out a company-wide memo that would become infamous. And just a few days later, he announced this huge, monumental decision that would basically seal Nokia's fate.
This was the core of that memo. He described Nokia as standing on a burning oil platform, with the fire of Apple on one side and the fire of Android on the other. Now, he probably meant to create urgency inside the company, but the memo leaked. And when it hit the public, the effect was catastrophic. It was an admission from the CEO himself that Nokia's own products were failing. Confidence in the brand just evaporated overnight.
So, with the company pretty much in panic mode, Elop pushed through his strategy. It was a three-step plan that would change everything. First, abandon their own Symbian OS. Second, and this is the one people still argue about, he rejected Android. And third, he bet the entire company on one single unproven platform, Microsoft's brand new Windows Phone.
The result was a complete and utter disaster. The new Nokia Lumia phones running Windows were seen as clunky, and developers just weren't interested. The numbers here are just staggering. In over 2.5 years, Nokia sold 52 million Windows phones. To put that in perspective, Samsung, which went with Android, sold that exact same number of phones in just 2 months. The bet had catastrophically failed.
And that brings us to the final act of this tragedy. In 2014, Microsoft bought Nokia's entire phone business for $7.2 billion. And Stephen Elop, the man hired to save Nokia, just went right back to Microsoft to become the head of their new mobile division. Under his leadership, Nokia's market share had plummeted from that dominant 33% to less than 3%. It really seemed like the end of the story.
But it wasn't. See, while the phone division was having this very public, very spectacular implosion, another part of Nokia was quietly surviving in the background. In 2014, a new CEO, Rajiv Suri, took over what was left of the company. His plan was the polar opposite of Elop's. No drama, no risky bets. It was a new, and you could say, boring strategy. Suri's vision was to completely change who Nokia's customer was. Forget selling phones to you and me. The future was B2B, business to business. From now on, Nokia would sell the complex, invisible infrastructure that actually makes our connected world possible.
Suri's plan was very methodical. He restructured the company and cut costs. He used money from the Microsoft sale to win back investor trust by paying dividends. Then he made a really smart acquisition, a company called Alcatel-Lucent. He wasn't after their products. He wanted their legendary research wing, Bell Labs. And with that R&D powerhouse in his corner, he made one big, patient, long-term bet, 5G.
And after years of just quietly investing and working, it paid off. In 2018, Nokia unveiled the Reef Shark, a revolutionary new chipset designed specifically for 5G networks. It was smaller, 3 times faster, and used over 60% less power than the old tech. This was the key that was going to unlock Nokia's new kingdom.
So now, armed with this incredible new technology, Nokia was reborn. They had gone from being the world's most famous failed phone maker to a global leader in the very technology that would power the next decade of communication. What a turnaround.
And the turnaround was a massive success. Today, if you look at the global 5G infrastructure market outside of China, Nokia controls nearly 29% of it, going toe-to-toe with giants like Huawei and Ericsson. They've landed over 300 commercial 5G deals, and their technology now supports over 6.4 billion subscriptions worldwide.
I mean, this table just lays it out so perfectly. It's a tale of 2 completely different philosophies. You've got the Elop era, a high-risk gamble on consumers that led to a nearly €5 billion loss, and the sale of their most famous division. And then you have the Suri era, a patient, long-term bet on B2B infrastructure that now generates over $20 billion in annual revenue. The contrast is just wow.
So look, let's be clear, Nokia is not the king of phones anymore, and its market value is a fraction of what it was at its peak. But it has something it hasn't had in a very, very long time: stability. The company survived what seemed like an impossible collapse by finding a completely new identity.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. In our world, which worships radical disruption and high-stakes gambles, is it possible that the bravest, most strategic move a company can make is to choose the stable, quiet, and, maybe even the boring path to survival?